The deserts of Arizona Territory bred their share of legendary figures in the years following the war between the states, men whose names were whispered around campfires and whose deeds became the stuff of dime novels. There was Sidewinder Jack Henderson, the Apache Shadow, Three-Finger Mike Collins, and the infamous Wolfe Brothers. But perhaps no figure inspired more terror in the hearts of outlaws, or more debate about their true identity, than the one they called the Phantom. Some claimed he was a former Union sharpshooter driven mad by the horrors of Gettysburg. Others swore he was a Confederate cavalry officer seeking redemption for wartime sins. The truth, as it often does, lay buried deeper than any of the storytellers knew. What was known was this: over the course of 5 years, 28 of the territory's most notorious outlaws had met their end at the hands of this mysterious figure. No witnesses, no warnings, just bodies found in the morning sun, each with a single bullet placed with surgical precision. "He ain't natural," Bart Wolfe once declared in a Tucson saloon, mere weeks before his own death. "No man moves that quiet, shoots that straight. He's a phantom sure as I'm standing here." Wolfe wouldn't be standing much longer after that declaration. Join me today as we delve into the story of how 5 brutal men cornered what they thought was easy prey, only to discover they'd stumbled upon the territory's deadliest legend. But before we dive in, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe. Tomorrow's video will reveal what happened to the notorious Wolfe Brothers, and trust me, you won't want to miss that one. Silver Gulch, Arizona Territory, August 1875. The heat rose from the desert floor in shimmering waves, distorting the horizon like ripples in a sun-baked pond. The town was like many others scattered across the territory, a collection of sun-bleached buildings clinging to existence along a dusty main street, where hope and desperation danced together in the merciless Arizona sun. The stranger rode in on a dun-colored horse just as the afternoon stage was pulling out. Those who noticed his arrival would later recall 3 things: the well-worn cavalry saddle he rode, the way his dark duster seemed to absorb the sunlight rather than reflect it, and, most notably, the fact that he wore his gun backward in a cross-draw holster, an unusual choice that spoke of a man who'd learned his lessons the hard way. Marshal Tom Hawkins, watching from the shade of his office porch, noted something else: the way the stranger's eyes swept the street in practiced patterns, marking exits, lines of sight, potential cover. 2 kinds of men watch a street that way, he'd later write in his journal. Hunters and hunted. This one had the look of both. The stranger dismounted outside Morgan's general store, his movements economical, almost graceful. Inside, Sarah Morgan looked up from her ledger as the bell above the door chimed softly. The man who entered seemed to bring a piece of the desert's silence with him. His face, shadowed by a broad-brimmed hat, bore the weathered look of someone who'd spent too many years under harsh suns, but it was his eyes that caught her attention, pale blue like sun-bleached steel, and carrying the kind of weariness that sleep couldn't cure. "Water and supplies," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Enough for a week." As Sarah gathered his requests, the stranger's gaze drifted to the wanted posters on her wall. One in particular seemed to hold his attention, a sketch of a shadowy figure with a substantial reward beneath it. "The Phantom," Sarah offered, following his gaze. "They say he's been haunting these parts lately. Not that anyone's ever seen him proper-like and lived to tell of it." The stranger's only response was a slight nod as he counted out coins for his supplies. The silver dollars he placed on the counter were worn smooth, as if they'd passed through countless hands on their journey to this moment. What neither Sarah nor the stranger knew was that 5 pairs of eyes were watching the store with predatory interest. Buck Hawley and his gang had ridden into Silver Gulch the previous night, their saddlebags heavy with gold from the Prescott stage robbery. They'd been looking for a quiet place to lay low until the heat died down. Instead, they'd found what appeared to be an easy mark: a lone traveler, trail-worn and seemingly vulnerable. "Looks like our luck's turning, boys," Buck grinned, watching the stranger secure his supplies to his saddle. "Bet those saddlebags are worth investigating. And if he objects—" Buck's hand dropped to his gun, completing the thought better than words ever could. The sun was starting its slow descent toward the western horizon, painting the desert in shades of blood and gold. In less than an hour, Buck Hawley would learn a harsh lesson about judging books by their covers, and Silver Gulch would witness firsthand why some legends are best left undisturbed. Buck Hawley had built his reputation on being smarter than the average outlaw. While other bandits rushed in guns blazing, Buck preferred careful planning and precise execution. He'd survived 12 years in the territory by choosing his marks carefully and never taking unnecessary risks. But something about the stranger made his usual caution war with his greed. "Way I figure it," he told his men as they watched from the shadows of the livery stable. "Man traveling alone in these parts, keeping to himself like that, probably carrying a fair bit of gold, might even be running from something." His second-in-command, a scarred Mexican named Vicente, wasn't so sure. "No sé, jefe," Vicente muttered, unconsciously crossing himself. "Something about him. The way he moves. Like a mountain lion pretending to be a house cat." In the gathering dusk, the stranger led his horse toward the White Rock Hotel, seemingly oblivious to the predatory eyes tracking his movement. Sarah Morgan, watching from her store window, noticed how he kept the setting sun at his back, using the glare to mask his features. It was the kind of detail that might seem accidental to most, but to those who knew what to look for, it spoke volumes. Marshal Hawkins had seen enough trouble in his 15 years wearing the badge to recognize when a storm was brewing. He'd been watching Buck's gang since they rode in, noting how they'd separated to cover different parts of town. Now, seeing them converge on the stranger, he felt that familiar tightness in his gut that always preceded violence. "Might want to stay inside tonight, Miss Sarah," he advised, stepping into the general store. "Weather's fixing to turn ugly." The stranger had just finished stabling his horse when the first move was made. Jed Tucker, the youngest of Buck's gang, deliberately bumped into him while exiting the stable. "Watch where you're going, old man," Jed sneered, hand hovering near his gun. The stranger's response was subtle, a slight shift in stance, a minimal adjustment that somehow made his cross-draw holster more accessible. "No harm done," he said quietly, his voice carrying that same whisper-soft quality that Sarah had noted earlier. But there was something else in it now, an edge like a razor wrapped in silk. Buck, watching from across the street, saw an opportunity. He strolled over, playing the role of peacemaker. "Now, Jed, that ain't no way to treat a visitor to our fine town." His smile was friendly, but his eyes were cold as desert nights. "Let me make it up to you, stranger. Join us for a drink at the saloon. First round's on me." Those who witnessed what happened next would later swear the stranger's pale blue eyes seemed to change, becoming somehow colder, more calculating. "Appreciate the offer," he replied, "but I prefer to drink alone." "Wasn't really asking," Buck said softly, his friendly demeanor slipping just enough to reveal the threat beneath. By now, his other men had moved into position, Vicente near the water trough, the Cooper brothers flanking the stable doors, and Jed still blocking the direct path to the hotel. The stranger seemed to notice none of this, but Marshal Hawkins, observing from his office, saw how the man's weight had shifted slightly forward onto the balls of his feet. It was a subtle tell, one that most would miss, but to experienced eyes, it was like watching a rattler coil before striking. "You boys seem awful interested in a simple traveler," the stranger remarked, his voice still quiet but somehow carrying clearly in the evening air. "Makes a man wonder what kind of welcome Silver Gulch usually offers its visitors." Buck's hand moved slightly closer to his gun. "Just trying to be friendly, unless you've got some reason to be unfriendly?" The tension in the street had become palpable. A few townspeople, sensing the impending violence, hurried indoors. Sarah Morgan found herself holding her breath, though she couldn't have said why. Even the desert wind seemed to pause, as if waiting to see what would happen next. What no one in Silver Gulch knew, not Buck Hawley, not Marshal Hawkins, not even Sarah Morgan, was that they were about to witness firsthand why the Phantom had become the most feared legend in the territory. The next few minutes would become the stuff of whispered stories in saloons across Arizona, A tale of what happens when 5 predators corner what they think is prey, only to discover they've trapped something far deadlier than themselves. The sun had dipped lower, casting long shadows across Silver Gulch's main street. The evening stage was due in an hour, but Marshal Hawkins knew that whatever was about to unfold would be finished long before then. He'd seen enough showdowns to recognize the signs, the way the air seemed to thicken, the unnatural quiet that fell over the town, as if every living thing could sense the approaching storm. "Last chance to reconsider that drink," Buck Hawley said, his friendly tone wearing thinner with each word. His men had tightened their circle almost imperceptibly, like wolves closing in on wounded prey. But Vicente, watching the stranger's eyes, saw something that made his stomach knot. There wasn't a trace of fear in that pale blue gaze, not even a hint of concern. "You boys picked the wrong traveler," the stranger said, his voice still barely above a whisper. But something in that whisper made Buck's trigger finger twitch involuntarily. "Walk away now, and we'll all see tomorrow's sun rise." Jed Tucker, young and full of misplaced confidence, barked out a laugh. 5 guns against 1, old man. Them ain't the kind of odds that end with talking." "Numbers don't matter much to a ghost," the stranger replied, and something in the way he said it, soft, almost sad, made Sarah Morgan's blood run cold. She'd been watching from her store window, and in that moment, she noticed something that had escaped her attention earlier. The stranger's duster had subtle patches sewn into it, places where bullets might have torn through in the past. Buck Hawley, however, was past the point of caution. The stranger's calm demeanor had gotten under his skin, making him feel like the prey rather than the hunter. It wasn't a feeling he was used to, nor one he appreciated. "Enough talk. Your saddlebags. Now." "Tell me something first," the stranger said, seeming to ignore the demand entirely. "That stage you hit outside Prescott 3 days ago, the guard, Samuel Chen, did he draw on you before you shot him?" The question landed like a thunderbolt in the growing dusk. Buck's face went slack for just a moment before his eyes narrowed dangerously. "How do you—" "He had a wife in Tucson," the stranger continued, his voice growing, if possible, even softer. 2 young daughters. Man like that carrying a gun but protecting something more precious than gold, I'm betting he never even cleared leather." Vicente's hand had already started moving toward his gun when he saw it, the change in the stranger's stance. It was subtle, almost invisible, but to a man who'd survived 20 years of violence, it was like watching death itself prepare to dance. "Dios mío," Vicente breathed, but his warning came too late. "Kill him," Buck roared, his own gun starting to clear its holster. But the stranger had been moving before the words left Buck's mouth, his backward-mounted gun seeming to materialize in his hand as if conjured from thin air. Marshal Hawkins, who'd seen his share of gunfights, would later say he'd never witnessed anything like what happened next. "It wasn't just the speed," he wrote in his journal that night. "It was the precision, like watching a surgeon instead of a gunfighter." The first shot took Jed Tucker before the young outlaw's gun had cleared his holster, the bullet finding his shoulder with surgical accuracy, a wound that would end his gunfighting days without ending his life. The second shot struck Vicente's gun hand with similar precision, sending his weapon spinning away into the dust. The Cooper brothers, more experienced than Jed, but not nearly experienced enough for this fight, managed to get off 2 wild shots that hit nothing but air. The stranger's return fire dropped them both, one with a knee shot, the other with a bullet that shattered his gun hand. Buck Hawley, fastest gun in 3 territories, found himself facing something he'd never encountered before, an opponent whose draw he hadn't even seen. His gun was halfway up when the stranger's last bullet struck his forearm, sending his prized Colt flying. The entire exchange had taken less than 5 seconds. As the echo of gunshots faded into the desert evening, a new sound emerged. The metallic click of the stranger methodically reloading his weapon, each motion precise and unhurried. 5 men lay in the street, each disabled but none dead, their wounds placed with a deliberate accuracy that spoke of absolutely mastery. "Ghost," Vicente whispered from where he cradled his shattered hand. "El Fantasma," The setting sun painted the street of Silver Gulch in shades of crimson, the color matching the small pools of blood spreading beneath Buck Hawley's wounded men. Marshal Hawkins stepped off his office porch, his own gun still holstered. He'd recognized within seconds of the shooting starting that his intervention wouldn't be necessary. "Mighty fine shooting," the marshal said, approaching the stranger with deliberate casualness. "Don't recall ever seeing anyone handle a cross-draw that's smooth." The stranger finished reloading before responding, each cartridge sliding home with practiced precision. "Had a lot of practice," he replied, his voice still carrying that whisper-soft quality that somehow seemed more noticeable in the aftermath of gunfire. Dr. Marcus Wheeler, the town's physician, emerged from his office with his medical bag, summoned by the sound of gunshots. He surveyed the wounded men with professional detachment. "None of these are fatal," he observed, kneeling beside Jed Tucker. "In fact, they're—" He paused, examining the wound more closely. "They're remarkably precise." "Almost like they were placed," Marshal Hawkins added, studying the stranger with newfound intensity. "Almost like someone wanted to end their gunfighting days without ending their lives." Buck Hawley, still clutching his wounded arm, glared up from the dust. "Nobody's that good with a gun. Nobody human, anyway." His eyes widened as realization struck. The Phantom. The stories about surgical shots, about appearing out of nowhere. Fear replaced the anger in his voice. "They said you died in that ambush outside Yuma last spring." The stranger's pale blue eyes fixed on Buck, and something in that gaze made the outlaw flinch. "Lot of stories about that day," the stranger said softly. "Most of them wrong." He turned to Marshal Hawkins. "You'll find wanted posters on all 5 of them. Buck Hawley and his gang. Prescott stage robbery 3 days ago. Guard named Samuel Chen didn't make it. Sarah Morgan had ventured out onto her store's porch, drawn by a mixture of curiosity and something else she couldn't quite name. She'd heard the stories about the Phantom, of course. Everyone had. Tales of a gunfighter who moved like a ghost, who never killed unless he had to, but whose aim was so precise he could shoot the gun out of a man's hand at 20 paces. "The stories," she said, her voice carrying in the evening quiet. "They say you're hunting something. Or someone." The stranger's eyes met hers for a moment, and in them she saw something that made her heart ache. A depth of pain and purpose that no amount of time seemed able to heal. "Not hunting," he replied. "Remembering." Dr. Wheeler had begun treating the wounded, helped by several townspeople who'd emerged from their hiding places. "These men need proper medical attention," he announced. "But they'll all live, though I doubt any of them will be drawing a gun again anytime soon." Vicente, his gun hand expertly bandaged, looked up at the stranger with a mixture of fear and awe. They said the Phantom only hunts men who kill innocent people, that he appears like a spirit to pass judgment." The stranger's hand unconsciously touched something beneath his duster, perhaps a badge, or a photograph, or some other token of a past life. "Justice and vengeance look mighty similar in certain lights," he said quietly. Marshal Hawkins had been lawman long enough to recognize there were questions that shouldn't be asked, mysteries better left unsolved. But one thing needed to be settled. "These men," he gestured to Buck and his gang, "they've got quite a bounty on their heads, dead or alive." "The bounty's yours, Marshal," the stranger replied, already turning toward the hotel. "Just make sure they face justice for Samuel Chen's murder." As darkness settled over Silver Gulch, the townsfolk helped move the wounded to Dr. Wheeler's office. Stories were already spreading, growing with each telling. How 5 of the territory's most notorious outlaws had cornered a lone traveler, only to discover they'd trapped something far deadlier than they could have imagined. But this was only the beginning. As Marshal Hawkins would soon learn, the Phantom's appearance in Silver Gulch was no accident. Something larger was brewing, something that would shake the Arizona territory to its very foundations. Night settled over Silver Gulch like a dusty blanket, bringing with it an uneasy quiet. The evening stage had arrived to find the town buzzing with whispered conversations about the afternoon's events. In the saloon, men gathered in small groups, their voices hushed, as they shared theories about the stranger's identity. Each telling of the gunfight grew more elaborate than the last. At his office, Marshal Hawkins sat at his desk, studying a stack of wanted posters by lamplight. Buck Hawley and his gang were secured in the jail cells behind him, their wounds treated by Dr. Wheeler. But it was another poster that held the lawman's attention, the one showing the shadowy figure known as the Phantom. "Thought you might want to talk about it," a quiet voice said from the doorway. The stranger stood there, his dark duster making him seem part of the night itself. Hawkins gestured to an empty chair. "Figured you might. Door's been mighty busy since sundown. Telegraph operator's been sending messages non-stop. Seems word of what happened today is spreading fast." The stranger settled into the chair with fluid grace, his cross-draw holster easily accessible even while seated. "Messages to whom?" "That's the interesting part," Hawkins replied, shuffling through some papers. "Got word back from Prescott. Seems Buck Hawley's gang wasn't just running from the stage robbery. They were running to something, meeting up with others of their kind." The stranger's pale eyes showed a flicker of interest. "How many?" "Hard to say, but rumors mention the Wolfe Brothers, Carson's Riders, maybe even the Apache Kids' Renegades, all headed this way." Hawkins leaned forward, almost like someone wanted them gathered in one place. A ghost of a smile touched the stranger's lips. "Smart man, Marshal." "Question is," Hawkins continued, "why Silver Gulch? We're not exactly a strategic location, unless ... He paused, studying the stranger's impassive face. "Unless someone chose it. Someone who knew the territory's worst would be drawn here like moths to a flame." Outside, Sarah Morgan was closing up her store for the night when she noticed something peculiar. Riders were arriving in small groups, tough-looking men who took rooms at the hotel or made camp outside town. Their arrival might have seemed innocent enough, but she'd grown up in frontier towns and recognized predators when she saw them. Back in the marshal's office, the stranger had risen and moved to the window, watching the same scene unfold. "7 years ago," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "there was a town called Haven's Rest. Good people trying to build something honest in a dishonest land." Hawkins knew the name. Every lawman did. Burned to the ground, not a soul left alive. 37 people, the stranger continued. Men, women, children. All killed because they refused to cooperate with a coalition of outlaws who wanted to use their town as a base of operations. His hand unconsciously touched something beneath his duster again. "I was the town's marshal." Understanding dawned in Hawkins's eyes. "You weren't just away tracking a horse thief that night, were you?" "I was meeting with territorial officials trying to get help protecting the town. By the time I returned..." The stranger's voice trailed off, but his eyes had taken on a hardness like frozen steel. "Took me years to identify everyone involved, to track down every last man who participated in the massacre. The Phantom's victims," Hawkins said slowly. "They weren't random outlaws. They were all connected to Haven's Rest. Yes." The stranger turned from the window. "And now, 7 years later, the last of them are gathering, right here in Silver Gulch." Dr. Wheeler's voice carried from the street below. "Marshal, you better come see this." Both men moved to the window. In the moonlight, they could see more riders approaching from the east, their numbers suggesting this was more than just a casual gathering. Silver Gulch was about to become a staging ground for something much larger than a simple confrontation between lawmen and outlaws. "This isn't just about justice anymore, is it?" Hawkins asked, though he already knew the answer. "No," the stranger replied softly. "It's about finishing what began at Haven's Rest, and making sure no other town suffers the same fate." Dawn broke over Silver Gulch to find a town transformed. The dusty streets that had yesterday hosted a single dramatic confrontation now teemed with hard-eyed men wearing gun belts low on their hips. Dr. Wheeler, making his morning rounds, counted no fewer than 30 new faces, each one carrying the distinctive look of men who lived by violence. Like watching wolves gather, Sarah Morgan observed from her store's doorway, speaking to no one in particular. She'd opened early, experience telling her that even outlaws needed supplies. Each man who entered her store carried the same predatory tension, their eyes constantly scanning for threats. The stranger had spent the night in quiet preparation. Those who passed his hotel room in the early hours reported the soft sound of a whetstone on steel, the methodical click of bullets being loaded into cartridges. Marshal Hawkins, watching the town from his office window, saw him emerge into the morning light, his movements as measured and precise as ever. The Wolfe Brothers arrived an hour ago, Hawkins informed him as he approached. Making camp north of town with about a dozen riders. Carson's group came in from the south, another 15 men at least, more arriving every hour. The stranger nodded, his pale eyes taking in the changed atmosphere of Silver Gulch. "They don't know they're being gathered," he said softly. "Each group thinks they're here for their own reasons. Following hints, rumors, whispered opportunities." "Breadcrumbs," Hawkins realized. "You've been laying a trail for months, haven't you? Leading them all here." 7 years of planning, the stranger confirmed. Learning their patterns, their contacts, their weaknesses. Every man who rode with them that night at Haven's Rest. Every last one. In the jail cells, Buck Hawley had been listening to the growing commotion outside. His wounded arm throbbed, a constant reminder of his encounter with the legend he'd foolishly challenged. "You don't understand what you've started," he called out to the marshal. "These men, they're not like regular outlaws. They're something worse." "We know exactly what they are," the stranger replied, his whisper carrying easily in the morning quiet. "Every one of them was at Haven's Rest, even if they don't remember it themselves." Buck's face went pale. Haven's Rest? That was just a story. A legend about a town that burned, the stranger interrupted. That died screaming while outlaws laughed and counted their spoils? No, Buck, not a legend. I was there. I saw what was left. And now, 7 years later, justice has come due. A commotion outside drew their attention. 3 riders were approaching from the east, their horses kicking up dust in the morning sun. Even at a distance, something about them commanded attention. The lead rider, a tall man with iron-gray hair and a face like weathered leather, carried himself with the authority of someone used to being obeyed. Marcus Wolfe. Hawkins identified him. Meanest of the Wolfe brothers. They say he once killed a man for commenting on his horse. "They say a lot of things about Marcus Wolfe," the stranger replied. "But they don't say what he did at Haven's Rest, how he personally shot the schoolteacher when she tried to protect her students." Sarah Morgan, who had drifted closer to hear the conversation, felt a chill despite the growing morning heat. "How many?" she asked quietly. "How many of them were there that night?" 53, the stranger answered, his voice carrying that same deadly softness. "I've spent 7 years tracking them down. Some died resisting. Others, like Buck's gang, will live to face territorial justice. Today's gathering will account for the last 28. Marcus Wolfe and his companions dismounted outside the saloon, their spurs ringing on the wooden sidewalk. Other outlaws gathered around them, drawn by the older man's notorious reputation. The stranger watched it all with the patience of a hunter who had finally seen his prey gather at the watering hole. "It's not too late to send for help," Hawkins offered. "I've got contacts in Prescott, men who would ride hard if I called." "No," the stranger said, checking his cross-draw holster one final time. "This ends where it began. One lawman against the darkness. Only difference is, this time, I'm ready for them." The morning heat rose with the sun, but inside the Silver Gulch saloon the atmosphere was already simmering. Marcus Wolfe held court at a corner table, his weathered face creased in a permanent scowl as various outlaws approached to pay their respects. His younger brothers, Luke and Matthew, flanked him like well-trained guard dogs. "Something ain't right about this gathering," Luke muttered, his eyes constantly scanning the room. "Too many of us in one place. Draws attention." Marcus silenced him with a look. "You getting soft, little brother? Worried about some territorial marshal?" His voice carried the kind of authority that came from decades of violence. "Way I hear it, every man in this room got some kind of tip about easy money or opportunity in Silver Gulch. That many separate trails leading to the same place? Ain't no coincidence." At a nearby table, Carson's riders were engaged in their own hushed discussion. Their leader, James Carson, was a former cavalry officer turned outlaw, and his military training made him naturally suspicious. "Anyone else notice something peculiar about the faces here?" he asked his lieutenants. "Take a good look around. Every major player who's ridden in, we've all crossed paths before." 7 years ago, one of his men said slowly, recognition dawning. "That town in the Southern Territory." "Haven's Rest," Carson finished, his face darkening. "Richest haul we ever took. Also, the bloodiest." Meanwhile, Marshal Hawkins had gathered Silver Gulch's prominent citizens in his office. Sarah Morgan, Dr. Wheeler, and a handful of business owners listened as he outlined the situation. "Town's filling up with the worst elements in the territory. I've sent telegrams to neighboring settlements for help, but realistically, we're on our own for at least 2 days." "What about the stranger?" Sarah asked. "The one they're calling the Phantom?" "He's got his own plans," Hawkins replied grimly. "Been setting them in motion for 7 years, from what I gather. Question is, how many innocent people are going to get caught in the crossfire when they play out?" The stranger himself had taken up position on the hotel's second-floor balcony, watching the street below with those pale, unnaturally calm eyes. His presence was like a shadow on the town, felt rather than seen. Every outlaw who passed beneath his position unconsciously walked a little faster, hands straying closer to their weapons. In his jail cell, Buck Hawley was piecing together fragments of memory. "I remember now," he said suddenly, causing Marshal Hawkins to look up from his paperwork. "Haven's Rest. I was there, but I wasn't part of the main force. Road scout, watched the approaches to make sure no help was coming." His voice grew distant. "Never went into the town itself, but I heard the screams. Saw the flames. The marshal was supposed to be there, but I wasn't." The stranger's voice came from the office doorway, causing both men to start. Neither had heard him approach. "I was 40 miles away arguing with territorial officials about increasing patrols by the time I saw the smoke on the horizon." He paused, and for the first time, real emotion cracked through his whisper-soft voice. "My wife was the school teacher, the one Marcus Wolfe shot. Our daughter was one of her students." Sarah Morgan, who had remained behind after the citizens' meeting, felt tears well in her eyes. "That's why you took to the badge again, became the Phantom." "The badge was never the source of authority," the stranger replied. "It was just a symbol of responsibility, of a promise to protect. I failed that promise once. Won't happen again." Outside, more riders were arriving. Apache Kids renegades had made camp on the outskirts of town, their presence adding another layer of tension to the already volatile situation. The gathering storm that had been building for 7 years was about to break, and Silver Gulch found itself at the eye of it. Dr. Wheeler, watching another group of hard-eyed men ride in, shook his head slowly. One man against all of them? Even if he is the Phantom, those aren't the kind of odds anyone can beat. "Maybe," Marshal Hawkins replied, remembering the surgical precision of yesterday's gunfight. "Or maybe we're about to learn why they call him a ghost." The afternoon sun beat down on Silver Gulch with merciless intensity, but inside the saloon a different kind of heat was building. Marcus Wolfe had called together the leaders of each outlaw band, their gathering drawing curious glances from lesser members who knew better than to get it too close. "Something's been nagging at me," Marcus growled, his scarred fingers drumming on the weathered table. "Been hearing whispers about Buck Hawley's gang, about how they were taken down yesterday by a single man." His cold eyes swept the assembled faces. "A man some are calling the Phantom." James Carson shifted uncomfortably in his chair. 7 years of outlaw life hadn't completely erased his military bearing, but something about this conversation made him feel like a raw recruit again. "Heard he shot them with surgical precision, disabled them all without killing a single one." "Just like the others," Apache Kid added, speaking for the first time. The renegade leader's face was impassive, but there was tension in his shoulders. "Over the past 7 years, how many of our associates have met this ghost? Always the same pattern. Those who were at Haven's Rest either die resisting or live to face justice." Outside, the stranger moved through the town like a shadow at noon, seemingly unconcerned by the growing number of hostile eyes tracking his movement. Sarah Morgan, watching from her store, noticed how he systematically checked angles, distances, positioning himself to maintain clear lines of sight to key locations. "He's preparing," Marshal Hawkins observed, having joined her at the window. "Setting up the battlefield on his terms." "But why here?" Sarah asked. "Why Silver Gulch? We're not even close to Haven's Rest." "Because of what the town represents," came the stranger's quiet voice behind them, causing both to start. Neither had heard him enter. Good people trying to build something honest in a dishonest land. Just like Haven's Rest, history doesn't have to repeat itself. Back in the saloon, realization was dawning among the gathered outlaws. 7 years, Marcus Wolfe mused, his voice dangerous. 7 years of our associates being picked off one by one, some killed, others captured, all connected to that night at Haven's Rest. His fist crashed down on the table. "It's been him all along, the marshal we thought died in the fire." "Impossible," Luke Wolfe protested. "Nobody could survive that inferno. We made sure of it." "Did we?" Apache Kid's dark eyes held ancient wisdom. "Did anyone actually see his body? Or did we just assume, drunk on victory and gold, that no one could have survived our vengeance?" In the marshal's office, Buck Hawley listened to the growing commotion from his cell. "You don't understand what's coming," he called out to Hawkins. "These men, they're not just outlaws. They're the worst of the worst. What they did at Haven's Rest, it wasn't just a raid. It was a message to any town that refused to bow to them. And now they're about to receive a message of their own," the stranger said, appearing at the cell door like a spirit. 7 years of planning, learning their patterns, their weaknesses, their fears. Everything has led to this moment. Dr. Wheeler entered the office, his face grave. "They're gathering weapons from their camps. Whatever's about to happen, it's happening soon." The stranger nodded, as if this too was part of his plan. "Marshal," he said softly, "you should get the townspeople to safety. The church basement should do. What's coming isn't meant for innocent eyes." "And what exactly is coming?" Hawkins asked, though part of him already knew. "Justice," the stranger replied, checking his cross-draw holster one final time. "Or vengeance. After 7 years, the line between them has gotten awful thin." Sarah Morgan, who had followed Dr. Wheeler to the office, felt a chill despite the afternoon heat. "There must be 40 armed men out there. Even a ghost can't face those odds alone." The stranger's pale eyes met hers, and in them she saw not fear, but a terrible certainty. "Someone once told me the ghosts can't die," he whispered. "After Haven's Rest, I aimed to prove them right." Late afternoon shadows began stretching across Silver Gulch like reaching fingers. The usual desert wind had died completely, leaving the town in an unnatural stillness that made every sound seem sharper, every movement more deliberate. Marshal Hawkins had successfully convinced most of the townspeople to take shelter in the church basement, though a few, like Sarah Morgan and Dr. Wheeler, stubbornly refused to leave. "You should go with them," the stranger told Sarah, his whisper-soft voice carrying easily in the quiet street. What's coming isn't something that needs witnesses. Haven's Rest had no witnesses, she replied firmly. Maybe that's part of why it happened. Someone needs to remember, to tell the truth about what happens here today. In the saloon, Marcus Wolfe had finished organizing his impromptu army. 43 men, all hardened killers, all veterans of countless raids and robberies. They'd spread out through the town in small groups, covering every approach, every possible angle of attack or escape. He's just one man, Luke Wolfe insisted, though his voice carried a hint of uncertainty. Ghost or not, he can't be everywhere at once. Marcus's weathered face creased in a cold smile. That's where you're wrong, little brother. Been thinking about all the stories these past 7 years, about how the Phantom seemed to appear out of nowhere, strike, and vanish again. About how he always seemed to know exactly where to find his targets. He paused, his eyes narrowing. He's been planning this since the day Haven's Rest burned. Everything. Every raid we stopped. Every trail we followed. Every opportunity that led us here. It was all part of his design. James Carson, the former cavalry officer, nodded in grim appreciation. Like a military campaign, he's been maneuvering us like chess pieces, and we never even realized we were in the game. Then let's change the rules, Apache Kid suggested, his dark eyes gleaming. If he wants us gathered here, maybe we should scatter instead. Disappear into the territory. Too late for that, Marcus replied. Look around. Really look. Notice how the street curves? How the buildings are positioned? His military training from before the war was surfacing. He's created killing grounds. Anywhere we try to run will be exposed to fire from multiple positions. Bastards turned the whole town into a trap. In his cell, Buck Hawley listened to the growing tension with increasing dread. Marshal, he called out, you need to understand something about Haven's Rest, about why we really burned it. Hawkins approached the cell, the stranger a silent presence behind him. Why's that, Buck? It wasn't just about the gold or sending a message, Buck explained, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cooling air. The town was building something, a symbol, proof that honest folks could stand against men like us and win. We couldn't let that happen, would have encouraged other towns to resist. And now, history's repeating itself, the stranger said softly. Only this time, Silver Gulch won't burn. This time, the law wins. Dr. Wheeler, who had been checking Buck's bandages, straightened up with a frown. Not much law I can see. Just vengeance wearing a badge's shadow. Sometimes, the stranger replied. They're the same thing. Outside, the outlaws had begun their final preparations. Each man checked his weapons, counted his ammunition, tried to steady nerves that had been increasingly frayed by the growing legend of their opponent. They'd all heard the stories by now, about the precision of his shots, about how he seemed to appear and disappear at will, about how 7 years of planning had led to this moment. Sarah Morgan, watching from her store window, saw something else. In the lengthening shadows, the stranger seemed to become less substantial, as if the approaching dusk was slowly transforming him into the phantom of legend. His dark duster no longer appeared to catch the light quite right, and his movements had taken on an almost ethereal quality. It's starting, Marshal Hawkins said quietly, noting how the outlaws had begun moving into their final positions. Whatever's been building these past 7 years, it ends today. The stranger checked his cross-draw holster one final time, his pale eyes surveying the battlefield he'd spent years preparing. No, Marshal, he whispered. It ended 7 years ago at Haven's Rest. This is just the reckoning. The sun touched the western horizon, painting Silver Gulch in shades of blood and gold. In the growing dusk, Marcus Wolfe made his move, stepping out onto the saloon's porch with the confidence of a man who'd faced down death too many times to fear it anymore. We know who you are, Marshal. His voice boomed across the unnaturally quiet street. 7 years is a long time to plan revenge, but even a ghost can die if enough lead fills the air. He paused, scanning the shadows between buildings. "You want justice for Haven's Rest? Let's talk about it, man to man." The stranger's response came from everywhere and nowhere, his whisper-soft voice somehow carrying to every corner of the town. "Haven's Rest wasn't about talk, Marcus. Or did you forget what you said to Mary, my Mary, before you shot her? Teachers got no place in our territory. Those were your words, right before you pulled the trigger." Marcus's weathered face darkened with rage. "That was business." The town had to burn. Had to show others what happens when they stand against us. Your wife, your kid, they were just part of the message. And now I have a message of my own. The words had barely faded when the first shot rang out. One of Carson's men, positioned on the hotel roof, suddenly clutched his shoulder and toppled forward, landing hard on a lower balcony. The wound was precise, painful, but not fatal, just like the shots that had taken down Buck's gang. "Hold your positions," Marcus bellowed as his men began firing wildly at shadows. "Don't let him draw you out." But the Phantom was already moving. A second shot caught Luke Wolfe in the gun hand, sending his weapon spinning away. A third disabled one of Apache Kid's scouts before the man could even clear his holster. Each shot came from a different direction, making it impossible to pin down the shooter's location. "He's using the town itself against us," James Carson realized, his military training recognizing the strategy. Every building, every alley, he's mapped out firing positions, lines of sight. "We're not just fighting a man. We're fighting the whole damn town." Sarah Morgan, watching from her store window, saw something extraordinary. The stranger seemed to flow through the shadows like water, appearing briefly in one spot only to vanish and reappear elsewhere. His dark duster made him nearly invisible in the growing darkness, and his movements had an almost hypnotic grace. "My God," Dr. Wheeler breathed, standing beside her. "It's like he really is a ghost." Marshal Hawkins, positioned in his office, understood what he was seeing. 7 years of planning. He probably spent months memorizing every angle, every shadow, every possible position. The whole town's his weapon. The Outlaws were beginning to break. Years of hearing stories about the Phantom had planted seeds of fear that were now blooming into full-blown terror. Every shadow might hide death. Every dark doorway could conceal their doom. Men who'd faced posses and armies were being unmade by a single opponent they couldn't seem to fight. "Stand and fight, you cowards!" Marcus roared, but his words were drowned out by more gunfire. The Phantom's shots continued to ring out with surgical precision, each one finding its target with uncanny accuracy. Men fell, clutching wounded arms, shattered hands, disabled legs, but none were killed. "He's not trying to murder us," Apache Kid observed, a note of understanding in his voice. "He's destroying us, taking away our ability to ever hurt anyone again." In his cell, Buck Hawley listened to the chaos outside with growing dread. "Should have known," he muttered. "Should have remembered what they said about Haven's Rest, about how he was different from other lawmen, how he believed in justice more than law." The sun had nearly disappeared now, the street lit only by scattered lanterns that created more shadows than light. The stranger's voice drifted through the darkness once again, carrying that same deadly softness. 7 years ago, you men brought darkness to Haven's Rest. Thought you could hide in it, use it to protect you from justice. A shot punctuated his words, followed by a cry of pain. But I learned to live in the darkness, learned to become it. And now, finally, the darkness is coming for you. Night had fully claimed Silver Gulch, the darkness broken only by scattered lanterns and the occasional muzzle flash. The sound of gunfire had become sporadic, punctuated by cries of pain and shouted curses, as more of Marcus Wolfe's men fell to the Phantom's precise shots. 17 down, Marshal Hawkins counted from his office window. All disabled, none dead, just like Buck's gang. "He's not just fighting them," Sarah observed, her voice hushed with understanding. "He's making them face judgment, real judgment, not just death." In the street, Marcus Wolfe was beginning to understand the true nature of his predicament. His carefully gathered force of hardened killers was being systematically dismantled, not by superior numbers or firepower, but by a single opponent who seemed to have turned the very night itself into a weapon. "Carson," Marcus shouted, "get your men to the stables. We'll make a break for it. Full gallop. All directions. He can't stop us all." James Carson's military training told him it was a desperate plan, but desperation was all they had left. He gathered his remaining men, their movements betraying their growing fear. "On my signal," he ordered. "Everyone rides hard. Don't stop for anything or anyone." The stranger's whisper drifted through the darkness like a cold wind. "Haven's Rest tried to run too. Remember, Carson? Remember how you and your men cut down women and children as they fled?" Another shot rang out, catching Carson's lieutenant in the shoulder. A second bullet found another rider's gun hand before he could mount his horse. The night seemed alive with the phantom's presence, his bullets finding targets with impossible accuracy even in the near-total darkness. "He's using our own fears against us," Apache Kid realized, watching from the shadows of the saloon. 7 years of stories about the Phantom. He's made himself into something more than human in our minds. Now, we're defeating ourselves. Dr. Wheeler had moved to his office, preparing for the wounded he knew would be coming. "I've never seen anything like these shots," he told Sarah as she helped him arrange bandages. "Each one precisely placed to disable without killing. It takes more than skill to shoot like that. It takes an almost inhuman level of control." The night air carried the stranger's voice again, seeming to come from everywhere at once. "You men brought war to a peaceful town 7 years ago. Thought your numbers made you invincible. Thought the law couldn't touch you. Another shot, another cry of pain. But I'm not the law anymore. I'm what comes after the law fails." Marcus Wolfe, his legendary composure finally cracking, fired wildly into the darkness. "Face me, damn you! Face me like a man!" "Like, you faced my daughter?" The words carried an edge sharper than any blade. "She was 7 years old, Marcus, reading her first book, learning to write her name. Did she look like a threat to your authority?" Luke Wolfe, nursing his shattered gun hand, felt the blood drain from his face. "Brother," he called out, his voice shaking, "maybe we should consider—" His words were cut off by another shot, this one catching Marcus's gun arm at the elbow. The notorious outlaw's weapon clattered to the street as he fell to his knees, clutching his useless arm. "One by one," the stranger's voice continued, as calm as a priest delivering last rites. "That's how I've hunted you all these years. One by one bringing justice to every man who rode with you that night. Some died resisting. Others, like you're about to do, lived to face territorial prison. But every single one faced judgment." In the marshal's office, Buck Hawley pressed himself against the bars of his cell. "You don't understand," he called out to anyone who would listen. "Haven's Rest. It wasn't supposed to go that far. Nobody was supposed to die, but Marcus, he got a taste for the killing. Said we had to make an example. And now you're all an example," the stranger replied, suddenly appearing in the office doorway, like a spirit materializing from the ether. "A lesson about justice, about consequences, about how some ghosts don't rest until their work is finished." The night had grown deeper over Silver Gulch, but the darkness held no comfort for Marcus Wolfe's remaining men. More than half their number now lay wounded, each man disabled by the Phantom's precise shots. James Carson, still clinging to his military training, had tried to organize a defensive position around the saloon, but morale was crumbling faster than his strategies. "He's not human," one of Apache Kid's men whispered, his voice shaking. "No man can shoot like that in the dark. No man can move like that." "He's human enough," Marcus growled, though his bravado was undercut by the way he cradled his wounded arm. "Just another lawman with a grudge. Flesh and blood like any other man." The stranger's voice drifted through the darkness again. "Want to test that theory, Marcus?" Like you tested my wife's courage before you shot her? Like you tested those townspeople's resolve by burning their homes? Sarah Morgan, watching from her store's second floor, saw something extraordinary happening. The remaining outlaws were bunching together, unconsciously seeking safety in numbers, but this only made them easier targets for the Phantom's precise shots. "Look at their faces," she whispered to Marshal Hawkins, who had joined her at the window. "The legend's becoming real to them. Every story they've ever heard about the Phantom is coming true before their eyes." In the street below, James Carson was reaching a similar conclusion. 7 years, he muttered, watching another of his men fall to a perfectly placed shot. 7 years of planning, of studying us, of learning our patterns. He's not just fighting us. He's dismantling everything we are. Apache Kid, his face unreadable in the darkness, had drawn his own conclusions. "This is more than revenge," he announced, laying down his weapons. "This is judgment. The spirits of Haven's Rest have found their voice." Marcus Wolfe's legendary temper finally erupted. "Cowards, all of you!" He staggered to his feet, blood dripping from his wounded arm. "He's one man against all of us." "Not one man." The stranger's whisper seemed to come from every shadow at once. "I'm what's left when you strip everything else away. When you take a man's family, his future, his very reason for living. I'm what rises from those ashes." Dr. Wheeler, treating the wounded that had been brought to his office, noticed something peculiar about the injuries. "Each shot," he explained to Sarah, "it's not just precise, it's symbolic. Gun hands, shooting arms, legs used to ride down innocent people. He's taking from them exactly what they used to terrorize others." In the jail cell, Buck Hawley had grown increasingly agitated. "Marcus!" he shouted through the window. Tell them what really happened at Haven's Rest about the gold." Marcus's face contorted with rage. "Shut your mouth, Buck." But the stranger's voice cut through the night again. "The gold shipment, that's what started it all, wasn't it? The town wouldn't cooperate with your plan to rob it, wouldn't let you use their homes to stage your ambush. So you decided to make an example of them." The remaining outlaws exchanged uneasy glances. Many of them had never known the full story behind the Haven's Rest massacre. Some had been told it was about territory, others about sending a message. The truth, it seemed, was both simpler and more terrible. "All those lives," Marshal Hawkins said quietly. "All those innocent people. For gold?" "For control," the stranger corrected, materializing from the shadows near the jail. "The gold was just an excuse. They needed to show what happened to towns that didn't bow to their will, that stood up for what was right." The night air had grown thick with tension. Marcus Wolfe's remaining men, now numbering less than 15, found themselves facing a choice: stand with their leader against what seemed to be a supernatural force of vengeance, or surrender to what increasingly felt like inevitable judgment. 7 years ago, the stranger continued, his voice carrying that same deadly softness. "You men played at being ghosts. Used the darkness to hide your crimes, but you never understood what a real ghost was. Never understood what happens when vengeance learns patience, when justice becomes a phantom." The breaking point came just before midnight. Apache Kid, his stoic demeanor finally cracking, made his decision. "It's over," he announced, stepping into the moonlit street with his hands raised. "My men and I are done. Whatever happened at Haven's Rest, we've paid enough for it tonight." James Carson, watching another of his men fall to a precisely placed shot, followed suit. "Stand down," he ordered his remaining followers. "We're facing something here that bullets can't stop." Marcus Wolfe watched in impotent rage as his carefully gathered force continued to crumble. One by one, hardened killers laid down their weapons, their spirits broken not just by the Phantom's deadly accuracy, but by the inexorable certainty of his justice. "Cowards!" Marcus spat, his face twisted with fury. "All of you. 7 years ago you were warriors. Now you surrender to a shadow?" "Not a shadow." The stranger's voice drifted from the darkness. "A reckoning. the kind that comes to all men who think their power puts them above justice. Sarah Morgan, still watching from her store window, saw something extraordinary happening. As each outlaw surrendered, the stranger seemed to become more substantial, as if their acceptance of judgment was somehow making him more real. His movements were no longer quite so ghostly, his presence no longer quite so ethereal. "He's finishing it," Marshal Hawkins observed quietly. 7 years of hunting, of planning, of becoming the very thing they feared most. And now he's bringing it all to an end. Dr. Wheeler, who had been treating the wounded throughout the night, emerged from his office with a look of wonder on his face. "In all my years of medicine, I've never seen shooting like this. Every wound precisely placed to disable without killing. It's not just skill, it's artistry." Luke Wolfe, his shattered gun hand throbbing, finally turned to his brother. "Marcus, it's finished. The Phantom. He's beaten us. Not just tonight, but over 7 years. Every move we made, every decision, he was guiding us here to this moment." But Marcus Wolfe had passed beyond reason. The legendary outlaw leader, who had terrorized the territory for over a decade, was reduced to a snarling, wounded animal. "Show yourself," he roared into the darkness. "Face me like a man. Or are you only brave when shooting from the shadows? Like you faced the people of Haven's Rest?" The stranger's voice seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Like you faced my wife and daughter? No, Marcus. You don't deserve the dignity of a face-to-face confrontation." In his cell, Buck Hawley pressed against the bars, his face pale with understanding. "I remember now," he called out. "That night at Haven's Rest, after the killing was done, when the fires were burning highest. Someone was watching from the hills. We all thought it was just shadows, tricks of the light. But it was you, wasn't it? You saw everything." "I saw enough." The stranger's voice had taken on an edge that made even the bravest men flinch. "Saw how you laughed while people burned. Saw how you counted your gold while children screamed. Saw how you celebrated your victory over a town whose only crime was standing up to evil." Marcus, driven by rage and desperation, made his final move. With his good arm, he grabbed one of his few remaining men, using him as a shield while drawing a hidden derringer. "Come out now," he demanded, "or this man dies. Your precious justice won't let you sacrifice an innocent?" The night seemed to hold its breath. Sarah found herself gripping the window frame so hard her knuckles turned white. Marshal Hawkins's hand moved toward his gun, but he knew he'd never be fast enough. Then, like a spirit materializing from the ether, the stranger appeared. He stepped into the moonlight, his dark duster moving with an almost liquid grace, his pale eyes fixed on Marcus with the intensity of frozen steel. "7 years ago," he said softly, "you forced me to watch helplessly as you murdered everyone I loved, made me a witness to your kind of justice." His cross-draw holster seemed to glimmer in the moonlight. "Now you get to be the witness to mine." The final confrontation between Marcus Wolfe and the Phantom unfolded in a heartbeat, yet those who witnessed it would swear time itself seemed to slow. Marcus's hostage, a young outlaw barely out of his teens, felt the legendary killer's grip tighten as the stranger approached. "Stay back," Marcus warned, pressing his derringer against his hostage's head. "I'll kill him. You know I will." "Like you killed that boy in Haven's Rest?" the stranger asked softly. "The one who tried to save his mother from your men? He couldn't have been more than 15. His pale eyes seemed to glow in the moonlight. "You're right, Marcus. I know exactly what you're capable of." Sarah Morgan, watching from her vantage point, saw something change in the stranger's bearing. The ghostly quality that had marked his movements all night seemed to solidify, as if all the legend and mystery were being distilled into this one moment of pure human purpose. "Let him go, Marcus," Marshal Hawkins called out. "It's over. Look around you. Your men have surrendered. The territory's finest gunmen, all laid low by one man. There's no shame in accepting defeat." But Marcus Wolfe had built his reputation on never accepting defeat. His face twisted into a savage grin as he steadied his derringer. One more step, he threatened. And this boy's blood is on your hands, Ghost. The stranger stopped, his voice carrying that same deadly softness. 7 years ago, you made me watch as you destroyed everything I loved. Thought the lesson was that violence always wins, that enough guns and enough cruelty could break any man's spirit. His hand hovered near his cross-draw holster. But you taught me something else that night, Marcus. You taught me patience. What happened next would be debated in saloons across the territory for years to come. Some swore the stranger moved faster than humanly possible. Others insisted Marcus shot first, but all agreed on the outcome. The stranger's draw was like lightning, his shot placed with surgical precision. Marcus's derringer flew from his hand, his trigger finger shattered. Before the outlaw leader could even register the pain, a second shot struck his other hand, ensuring he would never again hold a gun. Marcus Wolfe, terror of the territories, fell to his knees in the dust of Silver Gulch. His hostage scrambled away, looking back at his former leader with a mixture of fear and disgust. "You could have killed me," Marcus said through gritted teeth. "All these years hunting us down. You could have just killed us all." "Death is easy," the stranger replied, holstering his gun with fluid grace. "Living with the consequences of your actions, that's justice." Dr. Wheeler approached to tend to Marcus's wounds, marveling again at their precise placement. "You'll live," he told the fallen outlaw, "but your gunfighting days are over, just like all the others." Marshal Hawkins began organizing the prisoners, many of whom still seemed dazed by the night's events. "The territorial prison will be mighty crowded after tonight," he observed. "Seems the Phantom's legend ends with quite a haul." "Not the Phantom," the stranger corrected quietly. "Just a lawman who learned that sometimes justice needs a longer road than law provides." As dawn began to paint the eastern sky, Sarah Morgan approached the stranger. "Will you stay?" she asked. "Silver Gulch could use a protector like you." The stranger looked at her for a long moment, then at the town around them. Where Haven's Rest had burned, Silver Gulch had stood strong. Where one town had been lost to darkness, another had helped bring light to a 7-year quest for justice. "Maybe," he said softly, "it's time for ghosts to rest. Time for justice to wear a badge again instead of a shadow." Marshal Hawkins smiled, understanding the deeper meaning. "Town could use a deputy," he offered. "Someone who knows the difference between law and justice and how to balance them both." The stranger nodded, watching the sunrise paint the desert in shades of gold. 7 years of hunting, of planning, of becoming something more than human in the minds of evil men. It was finally over. Haven's Rest had its justice, and perhaps its marshal could finally find peace among the good people of Silver Gulch. "Looks like the Phantom's work is done?" Sarah observed. "No," the stranger replied, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. "Not the Phantom. Just a man who remembered that true justice, like the dawn, always comes to those who wait."